When you finally stop and look back at the path you've walked, you begin to realize something you never saw before, something powerful, unexpected, and deeply personal. You start to understand that your story didn't unfold by accident and the pain you endured wasn't meaningless. Because whether you realize it or not, there is a reason you were placed in the life of someone who tried to drain your spirit, confuse your mind, and weaken your identity, and that reason is far bigger than the chaos you lived through. What feels like destruction today may actually be the foundation of your becoming. What feels like punishment may actually be preparation, and what feels like abandonment may actually be divine positioning. Because sometimes God allows you to step into the darkness so you can discover the strength you never knew you had. There comes a moment when you wake up and realize that the person you cared for, fought for, stayed for, and prayed for was never meant to define your worth. They were meant to reveal it. They were a mirror, but not the kind that shows your reflection. They were the mirror that exposes cracks, exposes fears, exposes wounds you didn't know existed. And only when you stand in front of such a mirror can you begin to transform. People often ask, why did God allow me to meet a narcissist? Why did he let me love someone who only loved themselves? Why was I put into a story where everything I gave was taken, where every truth I spoke was twisted? But what if the answer is not that you were cursed, but that you were called? What if the very thing you think broke you is the thing meant to remake you into a stronger, wiser, spiritually awakened version of yourself? The idea that the narcissist was not a curse but a catalyst for your awakening is one of the most powerful truths you can embrace after surviving a toxic connection that drained your spirit and left you questioning your worth. When you look back at everything you endured, the manipulation, the confusion, the emotional highs and devastating lows, you begin to realize that something deeper was happening beneath the surface. It wasn't simply about heartbreak or betrayal. It was about uncovering the parts of yourself that you had forgotten, ignored, or suppressed. Sometimes life places you in situations that feel impossible, not because you deserve pain, because pain has a way of revealing who you truly are, and nothing wakes a person up faster than being challenged at the core of their identity. Before the narcissist, you likely gave freely, loved deeply, trusted easily, and forgave repeatedly. These were strengths, but without boundaries, they also became vulnerabilities. You moved through life believing that others thought the way you did, cared the way you did, valued relationships the way you did. Then the narcissist entered your story and shattered those illusions. They exposed how unprotected your heart was. They pointed out every area where you overextended yourself. They showed you where you lacked limits, where you tolerated too much, where you silenced your own voice just to keep peace. It's painful to acknowledge, but the narcissist became the mirror reflecting your unhealed wounds and hidden weaknesses. Yet what feels like cruelty often becomes clarity. What feels like heartbreak often becomes awakening. And what feels like loss often becomes rebirth, because the truth is, you did not discover your strength by living a life full of comfort. You discovered it by living through a storm you weren't prepared for. The narcissist became that storm. They became the force that pushed you into emotional and spiritual growth you would have never chosen on your own. Without them, you might have continued giving away your power. You might have continued believing that self-sacrifice was love. You might have continued showing up for people who never truly showed up for you. The narcissist awakened the part of you that needed to rise. They forced you to learn emotional independence. They pushed you to rebuild your identity from the inside. They challenged you to find confidence without external validation. When someone constantly tries to twist your truth, you learn to trust your intuition. When someone constantly disrespects your boundaries, you finally learn to create them. When someone constantly devalues your worth, you begin to reclaim it. They didn't intend to empower you, but they did. They didn't plan to strengthen you, but they did. They didn't expect you to rise above them, but you did. In many ways, the narcissist was the catalyst that accelerated your transformation. They disrupted your life so deeply that you could no longer stay the person you used to be. You were forced to evolve. You were forced to grow. You were forced to step into a new version of yourself that is wiser, sharper, more aware, and more spiritually connected. You learn to recognize manipulation instantly. You learn to protect your inner peace. You learn that love should never cost you your identity. These lessons became the foundation of your awakening. You discovered a strength inside you that had been dormant, the strength to walk away, the strength to break trauma bonds, the strength to say no, the strength to choose yourself. These are not small victories. They are life-changing, and none of them would have emerged if the narcissist hadn't pushed you to your breaking point. Sometimes the breaking was necessary so the rebuilding could happen. Sometimes destruction becomes the doorway to your destiny. You might think the narcissist ruined your life, but in reality, they awakened it. They awakened your self-respect. They awakened your self-awareness. They awakened your spiritual sensitivity. They awakened your purpose. Pain became your teacher. Experience became your training. Faith became your anchor. You didn't just survive the narcissist, you evolved beyond them. You stepped into a higher version of yourself that is stronger, more aligned, and far more powerful than before. The narcissist was never the end of your story, they were the beginning of your awakening. If you want, I can now explain Keynote 2 into 700 words as well. The idea that the narcissist exposed wounds you needed to heal is one of the most profound and transformative realizations you can have after leaving a toxic relationship. At first, it feels impossible to believe. You look back at the chaos, the emotional roller coaster, the constant confusion, and you wonder how any of it could be connected to healing. You wonder how someone who caused you so much pain could have anything to do with your growth. But the truth is, healing rarely comes from comfort. Growth rarely comes from ease. Transformation rarely comes from calm waters. Sometimes life places someone in front of you who triggers everything you've buried, ignored, or pushed aside for years, not to destroy you, but to force what's hidden to rise to the surface. Before the narcissist, you may have believed you had already healed. You may have believed that old wounds were long gone, that childhood experiences no longer affected you, that past heartbreaks were behind you. But the human heart has a way of hiding things so deeply that even you don't realize what still hurts. Unhealed wounds don't disappear, they simply stay quiet until something or someone wakes them up. And the narcissist becomes that someone. Their behavior, their words, their manipulation, and their lack of empathy act like a spotlight shining directly on the parts of you that were silently bleeding. They exposed your fear of abandonment every time they pulled away emotionally, gave you silent treatment, or made you feel unimportant. They exposed your need for approval every time they made you question your worth, your choices, and your identity. They exposed your lack of boundaries every time you found yourself saying yes when you wanted to say no, giving more than you received, or sacrificing your peace to avoid conflict. They exposed your tendency to over-give, over-explain, and over-apologize. They exposed your habit of shrinking yourself just to keep someone from leaving. They exposed the unresolved parts of your story that still needed love, attention, and healing. And while their actions were painful, the exposure of these wounds became the beginning of your emotional and spiritual recovery. You cannot heal what you cannot see. You cannot fix what you don't acknowledge. You cannot transform what you keep buried. The narcissist didn't create your wounds, they revealed them. They forced you to face the patterns you've repeated throughout your life, the versions of yourself you outgrew but never let go of, and the emotional habits you inherited without understanding. You began to realize that your pain had a history far older than this relationship. The narcissist simply brought it to the surface. There is a kind of healing that only happens when you reach your breaking point, when you've tolerated too much, when you've stayed too long, when you've given everything and received nothing. It is in that moment, when it becomes too painful to remain the same, that you start doing the inner work you avoided for years. You start asking questions you never thought to ask. Why do I attract people like this? Why do I put others before myself? Why do I stay loyal to people who hurt me? Why do I mistake chaos for passion? Why do I think love is something I have to earn? These questions are painful, but they are also sacred because they open the doorway to self-discovery, self-awareness, and healing. The narcissist triggered these questions by showing you what unhealed parts of you were vulnerable to manipulation. That doesn't mean the pain was justified. It means the pain was revealing. It was a teacher disguised as heartbreak. As you move forward, you start to notice the healing unfolding. You begin setting boundaries without feeling guilty. You begin recognizing red flags instantly. You begin trusting your intuition in a way you never have before. You begin choosing relationships that align with your emotional needs instead of relationships that drain you. You begin valuing yourself with a depth you never understood in the past. This is the transformation the narcissist unintentionally initiated. The wounds they exposed weren't signs of weakness, they were invitations for healing. Every trigger, every emotional reaction, every moment of self-doubt was a clue pointing to an old injury that needed closure. And now you're doing the work. Now you're attending to the parts of your heart that were neglected. Now you're healing generational patterns, old narratives, childhood pain, and beliefs you carried for too long. The narcissist may have broken your heart, but they opened your eyes. They revealed what needed healing so you could finally become whole. They exposed the wounds that would have continued silently affecting your life, your relationships, and your decisions if you hadn't been forced to confront them. And that confrontation, as painful as it was, became the turning point of your healing journey. If you want, I can now explain Keynote 3 into 700 words as well. The truth that you learned your value by encountering someone who tried to diminish it is one of the most powerful lessons that emerges after surviving a narcissist. At first, it feels contradictory. How can someone who broke your confidence, questioned your worth, and made you doubt yourself end up teaching you who you truly are? But life has a mysterious way of revealing your strength through the very people who try to take it away. Before the narcissist, you may have known your worth on the surface, but you didn't fully embody it. You may have believed you deserved love, but you didn't enforce the standards that protect love. You may have thought you respected yourself, but you didn't realize how often you compromised yourself to please others. Then the narcissist entered your life and exposed every place where your self-worth was fragile, unguarded, or undefined. You learned your value not through their love, but through their lack of it. You learned it not because they appreciated you, but because they never did. Every time they invalidated your emotions, you discovered that your feelings matter. Every time they ignored your needs, you learned that your needs deserve attention. Every time they made you fight for their approval, you began to understand that your value is not something to be earned. It's something you already possess. Their behavior forced you to look inward, to ask difficult questions about why you tolerated so much, why you accepted so little, and why you kept giving chances they never deserved. The narcissist pushed you to recognize the difference between love and attachment, attention and respect, desire and devotion. They forced you to see that being needed is not the same as being valued. They taught you that someone wanting you around does not mean they appreciate your presence. They showed you that you can give your whole heart to someone who doesn't know how to hold even a fraction of it. And through that painful contrast, you started to understand your worth in a way you never did before. The relationship became a classroom where the lessons were disguised as heartbreak. You learned that your voice matters because they silenced it. You learned that your boundaries matter because they crossed them repeatedly. You learned that your peace matters because they disrupted it constantly. You learned that your emotions matter because they dismissed them every chance they got. Everything they failed to give you became a reminder of what you deserve. Everything they took for granted became clarity about what you should never accept again. You discovered your value the moment you realized the relationship was draining your energy, your joy, your confidence, and your identity. And yet, even through the damage, your value didn't disappear. It was still inside you, waiting to be reclaimed. That is the turning point. When you leave a narcissist, you don't walk away empty. You walk away with deeper self-awareness, with sharper intuition, with stronger boundaries, and with a clearer understanding of what you bring to the table. The narcissist may have treated you like you were replaceable, but losing you proves exactly the opposite. They couldn't love you properly, not because you weren't enough, but because they weren't capable. The moment you survived someone who tried to break you is the moment you discovered your unshakable worth. You learned to stop begging for bare minimum love because you began recognizing your own capacity to give deeply. You learned that the right person will never make you question your value. You learned that love should never require you to lose yourself. You learned that your kindness, your empathy, your loyalty, and your compassion are gifts, not weaknesses. The narcissist tried to twist these qualities into flaws because they couldn't match them. But now you see clearly your value intimidated them. Your heart overwhelmed them. Your authenticity exposed their emptiness. Through their attempts to diminish you, you discovered a confidence rooted not in how others see you, but in how you now see yourself. You learned to validate your own feelings, soothe your own heart, and rebuild your own identity. You realized you don't need to be chosen by someone who doesn't know how to choose themselves. You realized you don't need to prove your worth to someone who never valued their own, and most importantly, you realize that you don't have to earn love by shrinking yourself. You deserve love by being exactly who you are. In the end, the narcissist didn't define your value, they revealed it. Their mistreatment highlighted the importance of respecting yourself. Their manipulation taught you the importance of trusting yourself. Their inconsistency taught you the necessity of choosing yourself. And now, with every boundary you set, every red flag you recognize, every moment you choose peace over chaos, you prove how deeply you've learned your own worth. If you want, I can now explain Keynote 4 into 700 words as well. The belief that God positioned you in the narcissist's life for spiritual training and growth may not make sense in the beginning. When you're in the middle of the confusion, the emotional storms, and the constant feeling of being unappreciated, it's hard to see purpose in any of it. You question yourself, you question your choices, and sometimes you even question God. You wonder why you were placed in the path of someone who drained you rather than uplifted you. But as time passes and your perspective sharpens, you start to realize that this experience was never about punishment. It was about preparation. It was about shaping you, expanding you, strengthening you, and awakening parts of your spirit that had been silent for too long. God doesn't train warriors with comfort. He trains them with challenges that develop their discernment, deepen their intuition, and elevate their awareness. And that is exactly what the narcissist did without even knowing it. They forced you to look at yourself in ways you never had before. They exposed your weaknesses so you could strengthen them. They triggered your insecurities so you could outgrow them. They pushed your limits so you could learn how to set boundaries. They created emotional chaos so you could learn to center your peace. What felt like emotional warfare was spiritual training. The narcissist became the catalyst that sharpened your ability to detect energy, intention, and authenticity. You started to listen to your intuition more intensely because their presence forced you to. Every time their words didn't match their actions, something inside you whispered, "Pay attention." Every time they twisted your reality, something nudged you trust yourself. Every time they made you doubt your worth, a deeper voice reminded you you are more than this. Spiritual training doesn't happen in quiet, peaceful moments. It happens in moments where your soul is pushed to grow beyond who you used to be. You learn to see people not by what they say, but by what they consistently do. You learn to feel the weight of energy. When something feels off, when something feels wrong, when someone's intentions aren't pure. This is spiritual muscle. And the narcissist unintentionally helped you build it. God used their behavior to elevate your discernment so you would never again fall for things that look good but aren't good for your soul. This experience taught you to depend on your inner voice, your inner strength, and your inner wisdom in ways you never did before. You began to recognize the difference between someone who loves you and someone who uses you. You learned that manipulation has a pattern. You learned that emotional instability has signs. You learned that disrespect always starts small. These are lessons most people never learn until it is too late, but you learned them because God needed to prepare you for something bigger. He needed to shape you into someone who knows how to guard their heart without hardening it, someone who knows how to love without losing themselves, someone who knows how to give without being exploited, someone who knows how to walk away when their peace is threatened, someone who knows how to choose themselves with confidence rather than guilt. Spiritual training also involves shedding old identities, old wounds, and old beliefs. The narcissist challenged every illusion you had about yourself. You thought you needed to be needed. Now you know you don't. You thought love required sacrifice. Now you understand love requires balance. You thought loyalty meant staying. Now you see loyalty also includes leaving. You thought choosing yourself was selfish. Now you know it is sacred. Every tear, every confusion, every sleepless night became part of your transformation. Your faith deepened because you had to lean on something beyond yourself. Your patience expanded because you endured what felt unbearable. Your strength multiplied because you survived what tried to break you. This was not just emotional training, this was spiritual elevation. And when God saw that the lesson had been learned, that your spirit had awakened, that your boundaries had strengthened, that your intuition had sharpened, he pulled you out. Not because you failed, but because you graduated. The separation wasn't abandonment. It was recognition that your training was complete. You were not meant to stay in that pain. You were meant to rise from it. Now you walk differently. You see differently. You choose differently. You love differently. You protect your heart differently. You trust your intuition immediately. You recognize manipulation instantly. You know your worth deeply. That is the result of spiritual training. God didn't place you in the narcissist life so they could win. He placed you there so you could grow, awaken, evolve, and step into a higher version of yourself. What felt like a trap was actually preparation. What felt like suffering was actually strengthening. What felt like loss was actually alignment. You were not positioned to be broken. You were positioned to be transformed. If you want, I can explain Keynote 5 into 700 words as well. The truth that you are the blessing in the narcissist's life, not the other way around, is something you only understand once you step out of the fog, once your mind clears and your heart begins to heal. During the relationship, it never felt that way. You were the one giving, sacrificing, fixing, supporting, and holding everything together. You were the emotional anchor, the steady heart, the consistency they depended on. Yet, somehow, they made you feel like you weren't enough, like you were the problem, like your presence held no value. But the deeper truth is this: they needed you far more than you ever needed them. You were the light in their darkness, the stability in their chaos, the warmth in their emotional coldness, and the empathy they could never access within themselves. You were the one thing in their life that wasn't fake, manipulated, or transactional. You were genuine, and that alone made you the blessing. When you truly understand this, your entire perspective shifts. Narcissists seek people who have something they lack, something they crave but cannot create: authenticity, empathy, compassion, emotional depth, loyalty, and heart. These are the very qualities they tried to steal, exploit, and drain from you. They didn't choose you randomly. They chose you because your soul offered nourishment to their emptiness. Your presence made them feel significant. Your energy fed their ego. Your kindness made them feel powerful. But here's the irony. They mistook your power for weakness. They mistook your softness for vulnerability. They mistook your loyalty for blind devotion. But none of that diminishes the truth that you were the priceless gift in their story. Your love exposed their emotional poverty. Your stability exposed their instability. Your honesty exposed their lies. Your empathy exposed their lack of conscience. Even if they never admitted it, your presence confronted them with everything they lacked, everything they feared, everything they hoped no one would ever see. This is why narcissists try to diminish the people who possess what they cannot develop. They cannot match your depth, so they attempt to devalue it. They cannot fill the emptiness inside them, so they try to drain others. They cannot feel real love, so they sabotage it. They cannot grow emotionally, so they try to shrink those who can. But despite how they treated you, the truth never changes. You were the blessing. You brought meaning into their life. You brought purpose. You brought comfort. You brought connection. You brought understanding. You brought loyalty. They never appreciated it, not because you weren't valuable, because appreciation requires a level of emotional maturity they don't possess. Narcissists only appreciate what benefits them, not what transforms them, and your presence had the power to transform them if they had been willing to learn, but they weren't. That's the tragedy of the narcissist. They encounter people who could elevate them, but they sabotage the very gift placed in front of them. When they lost you, they didn't just lose a person, they lost their supply, their stability, their mirror, their emotional anchor. They lost someone who saw their potential even when they didn't deserve it. They lost someone who believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. They lost someone who offered unconditional support, understanding, and compassion. Losing you was not a small consequence. It was their karma. Because people like you don't come around twice. Your heart is rare, your empathy is rare, your loyalty is rare, your depth is rare, and rare things, once lost, are never replaced. Meanwhile, your healing becomes your victory, your growth becomes your proof. Your transformation becomes the evidence of your true value. You rise from the pain with clearer vision, stronger boundaries, and deeper wisdom. You become someone who no longer tolerates what once drained you. You begin choosing relationships that reflect the love you give. You begin protecting your energy with fierce self-respect. You begin attracting people who recognize your worth instead of exploiting it. While the narcissist remains stuck in the same patterns, you evolve into an elevated, empowered version of yourself. And that is the ultimate truth. They did not break your value, they revealed it. They did not dim your light, they highlighted how bright it was. They did not take your power, they exposed how powerful you are. You were the blessing they never honored. You were the blessing they took for granted. You were the blessing they will remember when it is far too late. Because now you see clearly, they didn't choose you because you were weak. They chose you because you were strong, and your strength, your love, your authenticity, your kindness, those were gifts. You were the blessing. If you want, I can now explain Keynote 6 into 700 words as well. When you reach the stage where your silence becomes stronger than your reactions, you begin to understand a deeper truth about your own power. A truth that is rarely visible when you are still emotionally entangled with someone who thrives on your responses. Silence is not the absence of voice. Silence is the presence of control. It is the moment when you no longer need to argue, justify, defend, or chase clarity from someone who was never willing to give it. Silence becomes a declaration of boundary and a shield, one built from self-respect rather than fear or anger. When dealing with a narcissist, this kind of silence is not passive, it is transformative. It signals the end of their access to your emotional energy. It says their manipulation cannot reach you because you are no longer standing in the same emotional space where their tactics once worked. This keynote teaches you that silence is not just a reaction, it is a strategy. Narcissists feed on resistance just as much as they feed on attention. If you fight, they feel important. If you argue, they feel validated. If you cry, they feel powerful. But when you go silent, not to punish, not to provoke, but to protect your own mental clarity, their entire psychological framework is disrupted. They cannot operate in a space where there is no emotional fuel. Narcissists rely on chaos. Your silence removes their oxygen. And in that stillness, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were buried under cycles of conflict and confusion. You start to see that your peace is something you can command, not something that depends on the behavior of another person. As this silence grows, you learn that you do not need to react to everything that hurts. You do not need to respond to every insult or explain yourself after every manipulation. Silence becomes a filter. Only what matters enters your emotional world, and everything else is blocked. You discover that walking away is sometimes louder than speaking up because it shows that you have evaluated the situation, understood your worth, and chosen yourself without waiting for someone else to validate that choice. Silence reflects maturity, strength, and a growth that the narcissist never expected. It is the moment where you shift from being someone who was emotionally reactive to someone who is emotionally intentional, and in that quiet, something else happens. You begin to hear your own thoughts clearly again. When you were in constant conflict, your mind was busy defending, explaining, decoding, trying to make sense of things that were deliberately meant to confuse you. The silence you embrace now allows space for clarity. You start to recognize patterns, red flags, and behaviors that you once ignored. You start to understand why things happen the way they did, not because the narcissist explains them, but because your mind is finally free enough to process them. Silence becomes a healing ground where your emotional wounds begin to close instead of being reopened every time the narcissist demands attention. The narcissist, meanwhile, becomes increasingly unsettled by this silence. They may perceive it as rejection, loss of control, or exposure of their own emptiness. They may try to provoke you, guilt trip you, or suddenly act concerned or affectionate. Not because they have changed, but because your silence threatens their power. But this keynote teaches you that you must hold your ground. Silence is not something you break the moment they show discomfort. Silence is something you sustain because it is for your healing, not their convenience. Their confusion, anger, or sudden interest is not your responsibility. Your only responsibility is your emotional peace, your self-respect, and your future. The most powerful part of this transformation is that silence eventually turns into strength without effort. You begin to realize you do not need closure from the very person who caused the wound. You do not need explanations from someone whose patterns already explain everything. You do not need validation from someone who benefits from your insecurity. Silence teaches you self-trust. It teaches you independence. It teaches you that your emotions belong to you, not to someone who twists them for control. And finally, silence becomes your new standard. You stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop giving second chances to people who treat your kindness like weakness. You stop allowing your energy to be drained by people who only take and never give. In silence, you rediscover yourself, your strength, your intuition, your purpose. And in that rediscovery, you realize that you did not lose the narcissist. You lost the version of yourself that tolerated them. That is the real victory.